Thank you very much to all of you who got back right on time. Thank you. That's great. It helps us ensure that we are on schedule. So with that, we're ready to get started, ladies and gentlemen, with the very first technical session today. And I hope you're all ready to be inspired, engaged, and educated by all of the perspectives on offer from our elite panel of speakers today. Now, we do have two panel discussions this morning, one before lunch, one after lunch. And I'd just like to make a mention of how we will be taking audience questions. Well, as you will notice on your tables, you have a QR code. So if you would like to ask questions to any of our panelists, all you need to do is scan the QR code. You will then be directed to a WhatsApp number, and then you can feel free to type in your question. That question will come to our moderator on stage on her tab, and she will then take your question from there. So we're trying to be very digitally savvy, so I hope you will cooperate with us. Feel free to use the QR code to send in your questions. On that note, let's get started with our panel discussion right now. Our first session is based on Reboot and Reimagine of government and public sector business and strategy. In this session, we will have two speakers, following which we will then resume with the discussion. Let me now introduce the panelists to join us on stage. We'd like to be joined by session chair and moderator, Ms. Gaini Punchiheva, who is head of marketing, digital and integrated media of Vijaya Newspapers Limited. I warmly welcome our moderator joiners. We'd also like to invite our two speakers, including Dr. P.G.K. Harish Chandra, Director of Economic Research Department at Central Bank of Sri Lanka, and Mr. Hikam Khalid, who is Vice President at GLT Freight, Saudi Arabia. We invite our speakers to join us up as well. Please do join us. Our panelists include Mr. Asanga Ranasinghe, Chairman, Sri Lanka Standards Institution. He's also Senior Faculty of the Postgraduate Institute of Management, University of Sri Jayawardhanapura. And our next panelist is Mr. Nalin Edrisinghe, who is CEO Designate at Pan Asia Banking Corporation, PLC. So with that, we now have our moderator as well as our two speakers and the panelists on stage right now. As I mentioned to you, we will first get started with the two presentations, and then we move on to the discussion. So without further ado, the first speaker will be talking to us about Reboot and Reimagine of Government and Public Sector, a macroeconomic perspective. To take us through this presentation, we're now delighted to invite to the podium the Director of Economic Research Department at the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. Ladies and gentlemen, let's put our hands together as we welcome our speaker, Dr. P.G.K. Harish Chandra.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And it's good morning to everyone. And I would, first of all, like to thank for inviting me the CPM organizing committee. So I'll take about, I think, 15 to 20 minutes to give sort of an update on the recent economic developments and what we are looking into the near to medium term in terms of the macroeconomic perspective. I'll just, I think I've been presenting recently in CPM, the forum as well, so I'll sort of be brief on the background to the current economic crisis, and it's well known now. Thank you. So it's well known now because Sri Lanka has been going through a difficult or rather challenging patch due to the twin deficit scenario, where we had persistent deficits in the budget balance, that is the fiscal deficit, and the external current account balance. So if we are going to have persistent deficits in the fiscal sector and the external sector, and the history has shown that, and experienced by many countries, that we are going to a very challenging economic sort of era, as we have been past and we are passing at the moment as well, because that definitely led to a sovereign debt crisis with budget deficits being financed from debt rather than through some sort of equity investment, and external current account balance, which is again financed by borrowing from overseas rather than like equity investment such as foreign direct investment. And this the fiscal sector issue of our revenue being very low compared to our expenditure commitment has been a structural issue, and which has links to the overall macroeconomy through various linkages, as we can talk in detail if we have time. But so these are all interconnected, interlinked in the macroeconomy. So our interest rates, our exchange rates, and the trade balance, the current and the budget balance are all connected, and we are seeing the culmination of all this impact with the sovereign debt crisis and the balance of payment crisis. So on the recent economic development, on the GDP front, we saw just yesterday our last year GDP data were released by the Department of Census and Statistics. So we saw last year the economic growth was negative 7.8, which is the largest on record in the Sri Lankan history, post-independence Sri Lankan history. As you can see here in this chart, the yellow bars are showing the quarterly GDP growth rates in real activity, which are showing a negative growth starting from quarter 1, mild negative, and quarter 2 was little large, and the quarter 3 and quarter 4 recorded double-digit contraction, and that's why we see the growth being negative at 7.8%, and we were projecting about 8% contraction in our working, but it is sort of good to see that the contraction was lower than feared. And going forward, this year, 2024, we are expecting a bottoming out of this contraction or negative growth. So you can see that if you take a trend, so the Q4 12.4 is the last year quarter 4, and Q1 this year will have somewhat similar level, and then from Q2 and Q3, Q4, we will see a significant moderation of this negative growth, and so we are hoping some positive growth towards the end of the year. And you can see the growth, the subcategories of growth, mostly recorded negative numbers, and the construction sector, manufacturing suffered the most last year because of the supply side disruptions that we have amidst the balance of payments crisis and the large depreciation of the currency by 45%. And as a result, another shock that we experienced last year is the high inflation, and it has been increasing quite substantially from March last year, with the depreciation as well to a great extent. And then again, rather good news is that we have seen in September our inflation has peaked, and from September last year it's been coming down consistently. So October, November, December last year, as well as during the first 2 months of this year, we have seen a moderation of inflation. And if you do a projection of the inflation path this year, this is our projection that we did in October last year, and we are revising our projections with the GDP numbers that came out yesterday. So we expect a faster deceleration of inflation during this year, and you can see the two red dots, which are the realized inflation data for January and February this year, below the projected level because of some delay in electricity tariff revision mainly. But we are factoring the electricity tariff revision and the second round impact of that may have some price pressures March, April, but and beyond. But we will benefit from the last year significant acceleration of inflation. So this year we will see the base effect in our favor, so that inflation will come down quite sharply during April, May, and June. So toward the end of the year, we are hopeful that we'll be able to see a single-digit inflation baseline scenario. But any projection is having some degree of uncertainty, because we are in a very dynamic world. I mean, globally also we'll see what's going through the U.S. economy, and the Fed was last week we were talking about the further hikes of federal funds rate. Now we are talking of actually loosening federal funds rate, and dollar has been depreciating quite a lot in recent days. And on the trade front, external front, we see, I'm showing the export performance and the import performance. The first chart shows the monthly exports. We can see the blue line is the last year monthly exports, which remain above 1 billion level on average, which is very good compared to the all pressures that we saw in the economy during last year. And in January, there is some moderation of export demand, mainly because of the global growth is been cooling a bit with tight monetary policy globally. But we will expect some sort of recovery going forward. But this will determine the external sector performance in a great way, in a big way going forward. And export performance has been some sort of a lifeline for us in terms of the provision of the forex that we needed to finance the imports, mainly the essential imports like fuel, coal, medicine, and etc. On the import front, you see in the middle chart, we are seeing moderation of import demand. The blue line is trending downward. So we started with $2 billion import, and with some restrictions of some selected import items due to the balance of payment pressures to save dollars for fuel and other essentials. And there is this deceleration of import expenditure, which was negatively impacting the economy, by the way, but it was needed to manage this balance of payments crisis. So therefore, we've been able to save some dollars and redirect these dollars towards essential imports. And January, we see imports being somewhat lower, about 1.4 billion US dollars. And going forward, we might see some pickup of import expenditure because there is some liquidity improvement in the banking sector overall, and there's some festive demand also will kick in March, April. But we won't expect a big increase in import expenditure because still our balance of pressures are not eased to expect a normalization of import expenditure going forward. But this good performance of exports and sort of moderation of imports helped us to contain the trade deficit, so ease the pressures on the exchange rate to a great extent, and contain the negative spillovers of the severe balance of payments crisis. Another area that we saw a recovery is the workers' remittances, because on the one hand we saw the grey market premia being very high, which attracted the remittances outside the formal banking system. But now that risk premia being very narrow, and the banking system has been getting these dollars from the overseas workforce. So with that, we saw the workers' remittances numbers improved in January and February, almost 100% increase in February this year compared to last year February, which is good news. But we have a long way to go as well. And one other factor which is supporting this is the labor migration. So in terms of workers' remittances, it is positive news, but in terms of our labor market dynamics, it may be negative, as we will see in a bit in another slide. Another area which is supporting us is the tourism sector, which is recovering very fast, and Sri Lanka has shown in the past that our tourism industry can recover very fast. So these lines are showing the earnings from tourism and the tourist arrivals. So this green line is 2021. You can see the COVID impact clearly. In January, February, we have had about over 200,000 arrivals, or over $300 million earnings, which have come down to us, almost zero level by April. And now these red lines show the current year's level, which is on par with what we saw last year, January, February. But we are seeing some further acceleration of tourist arrivals, hence earnings from tourism. But another area which is not doing quite well is the credit extended to the private sector by our banking system. In a way, this was expected with very tight monetary policy because we wanted to sort of tame inflation down with more without demand pressures being built up in the economy. And in response, the credit to the private sector actually started moderating. And you can see from like June last year onwards, these red bars show the contraction of credit to the private sector on month-on-month basis, and the January is also a negative level. And we are expecting some turnaround of credit to the private sector towards the second half of this year, because still we see the monetary conditions remain tight, and the interest rates are a little higher than expected. But the good news is that we are seeing some confidence is returning to the markets, both the domestic money market and the domestic foreign exchange market, because the liquidity in the domestic money market has improved a lot, and central bank has played a role there as well by injecting a lot of liquidity to the market, and also in the process of buying some forex in recent days, we have injected another large sum of liquidity to the market. So with that, we are seeing the interest rate structure as a whole is turning around, and you can see the downward adjustment of the overall interest rate structure from say late last year and up until now. The yellow line, which is on the top, is the government securities yields, the 3-month treasury bill rate, which is coming down, good news. And the red line is the average weighted prime lending rate, which is very much linked to our business plans, which is coming down by 5 percentage points thus far during this year, which is also very good. And the deposit rates, the blue lines, are also trending downward. It takes some time for the these rates to have full pass-through of the liquidity improvement, but we are expecting some moderation because our monetary policy rate, which is the line at the bottom, is at 16.5%, is very much low compared to the spread is very high because we are having some other issues in the government securities market with the debt, restructuring concerns and all of that. So that uncertainty, once it is sort of addressed in the period ahead with more clarity in terms of our debt sustainability and debt restructuring plans, we will see the faster moderation of these interest rates, high interest rates, towards some level which is in line with our monetary policy stance. And another area which is also sort of attracted a lot of attention during recent days is the exchange rate behavior, because we've been sort of maintaining some guidance to the market in the past from May last year. And because when you have in the balance of payments crisis, the managing exchange rate is quite important. Otherwise, things can go wrong very, very quickly and very easily. So with that, we've sort of had some market guidance in terms of the degree of volatility of the exchange rate. But from 7th of March this year, we've removed that guidance, allowing free movements of the exchange rate. in line with the improvements in the liquidity in the domestic forex market. Therefore, the rate actually appreciated quite substantially, and these days we are seeing some sort of volatility because market is adjusting to the developments. We have some import also sort of picking up some areas. So the market will find is the level of exchange rate hopefully in the days to come. So far during this year, the rupee has appreciated against the dollar by 7.7%, and last year we know the rupee has depreciated against the dollar by 44.8%. So let me finish my talk with another couple of slides on the labor market, as I just alluded a while ago. The labor market conditions remain deteriorated, and something that we can expect when you have negative growth of around 8%. So unemployment rate rose to 5%, as you can see here on the chart on the right, and the labor force participation rate came down to below 50%. And the areas that had a severe impact from these labor market developments is the manufacturing sector, which is the below 50 level, as you can see here in the chart at the bottom left-hand side, and the services sector. So we are seeing, as a result, a significant migration of labor, which is also very much in the news in recent months. You can see the acceleration of labor migration from month to month. Mainly the yellow bars are basically low or unskilled labor migration, and the red bars, which have gathered a lot of momentum in recent months, is the skilled labor. So we are going to see some unfavorable labor dynamics in the economy, which will have some longer term impact unless addressed urgently. So if you compare some numbers, in 2019 we had about 200,000 labor migration. In the COVID year we had about 53,000 migration, and 2021 we had about 117, and last year we had about 300,000, which is almost 100,000 higher than the 2019 level. So which is a concern, and which will have some ramification for the private sector as well as a whole. So this is my last slide to end. We are going to see our near-term macroeconomic outlook depending on key major sort of factors. One is the IMF, EFF finalization, which is expected in a few days' time. On 20th March, the executive board of the IMF is taking our case. We are hoping that the board approval will be available by then. And then how we can build on that positive sentiments, and how can we sustain that confidence which is returning to the market is one major area that we have to focus on. And then the reforms, and government has taken some bold decisions, bold reforms already. How can we sustain these reforms, and how can we get support from people to continue these reforms is another area. And then something beyond our control is the global developments, which are very dynamic during recent weeks, as you have noticed. So these are 4 areas which are essential in determining our near-term economic outlook. So with that end, let me stop my talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to our first speaker. That was Dr. P.G.K. Harish Chandra giving us a macroeconomic perspective on the theme of rebooting and reimagining of government and public sector. It's now time to move from the government and public sector to business, ladies and gentlemen. So to help us to reboot and reimagine business and strategic thinking, let's welcome our next speaker, who is the Vice President at GLT Freight, Saudi Arabia. Let's put our hands together for Mr. Hikam Khaled.
There has been no apt time than the present for us, citizens of a nation in crisis, to ask, in the great words of JFK, what you can do for the nation rather than what the nation can do for you. Honorable Chief Guest, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, Good morning again and welcome to this edition of the CPM's conference on Reboot and Reimagine, Government and Public Sector Business and Strategy. My keynote today revolves around the greatest crisis facing the nation today, not the shortages that we face every day, but rather the loss of its greatest asset and how to harness it. My name is Sikam Khalid. I have over 2.5 decades worth of experience in logistics and have been instrumental in creating innovative product solutions to help our customers and on major trade lanes. Today, in my keynote address, I'll be addressing first transformation, then national asset, empathy, touching a bit on Professor Vora's safety, psychological safety, the need of a nation, and finally my closing thoughts. So to reboot and reimagine, first we need to consider transforming a nation from within. And to understand how to transform and what leaders need to do, let's listen to the results from a research done by ANZ.
We recently did a piece of research on Fortune 500 companies over a 5-year period, and the results are illuminating. The companies that were successful at transforming outperformed the unsuccessful transformers by a factor of 3x. What did the leaders do? 5 things. First, they did it once and they did it right. They had an all-encompassing program across the company with the beginning, middle, and finish to it. Second, the transformation leaders went all in and they made it personal. To move the behaviors of tens of thousands of people, the leadership needs to be deeply committed to its success because people in the organization can see that and they can feel that. Third, they took fewer but bigger steps and combined the initiatives of the organization into a manageable set of high-impact initiatives. They did so because a large proliferation of small initiatives creates organizational drag and can implode a transformation program. Fourth, they anticipated and embraced disruption. Make the trend your friend. And last, they reinvested for success. Cost-out only programs fail. Take the dividend yield and invest it in winning in the marketplace. In summary, the stakes could hardly be higher. And if you're going to launch a transformation, go all in.
Absolutely. As Adam Dixon said, we have to go all in on a multi-year, multi-generational program as a nation with committed leadership taking big steps. What does big steps mean? Big steps is moonshot thinking. Again, I'm quoting JFK here. When he launched the moonshot in America, we need to look for the Sri Lankan moonshot by planning with fresh ideas, not the status quo, and keep reinvesting in the program. A moonshot is a difficult and expensive task, and the outcome of which is expected to have great significance to a nation. And to be successful, a moonshot should inspire, be credible, and finally, it has to be imaginative. Our beautiful nation, Sri Lanka. What is our most important resource? I'm sure all of us have been drilled since school days to say tea, rubber, and coconut, but I'm not sure that's the case. It is, right? Most of you, I hope, looking at this picture will understand that it is our people. The employees of an organization are the driving force behind its success. They design and build a product. They promote the product in the market, and the sales team sells the product. And a team of employees support customers using the product, without which there is no organization. Our children, and from it, our citizens, are our most important resources. We nurture them from the time they are born until they are educated and become ready to join the workforce. In economic terms, children are a burden until they start delivering to the economy. But unfortunately, as you can see here, and as also Dr. Harishchandra highlighted, 874,000 passports were issued last year. 30,000 was the highest monthly movement of foreign employment, citizens moving to foreign employment, and 26% was the demand of skilled labor fulfilled. I mean, overseas requirement was only 26 fulfilled. That's our skilled labor. So mostly Sri Lankans are moving as non-skilled labor, and that's not really helping our economy. As you can see here, the highest income from exports was 1.2 billion, but remittances from overseas workers was close to 800 million at the peak. And I'm sure if we were to increase skilled labor, this would overtake both tourism as well as exports and be a really high earner. Empathy. This is a point that I want to touch, which also Professor Bora explained to us earlier on psychological safety. What is empathy? Empathy is understanding the needs of a person to help them achieve the goals. But what has empathy got to do with government? It is about leadership, understanding the needs of citizens. Why we should empathize as a nation? Let's listen to Simon Sinek and take a look at how leaders can be empathetic.
One of the examples I like to share of what empathy looks like in the workplace is here's a fairly normal scenario. A manager walks into somebody's office and says, hey, your numbers are down for the third quarter in a row. We've had this conversation before. If you don't pick up your numbers in the fourth quarter, I don't know what's going to happen. An organization that embodies empathy, that same circumstance sounds different. It says somebody walks into the office and says, hey, your numbers are down for the third quarter in a row. We've had this conversation before. Are you okay? What's going on? I'm worried about you. There's the assumption that the person is not the problem, but they have a problem. And if we can give them a safe space for them to tell us what they're going through, personally or professionally, then we can help them. At least we can be there for them to support them. And so, empathy is core to what good leadership looks like. It's seeing people as people and recognizing that we all have personal issues and struggles and insecurities and egos and ambitions and we're just messy balls of human beings. And fundamentally, leadership is not about the results. Leadership is about taking care of the people who are responsible for the results. It's a human job. That's what leadership is.
Three points I want to address here in terms of identifying the needs of the people to harness their potential. First is the skills growth, to increase skills growth by continued skills development, CSD as I call it. For me, is higher than CPD, continued professional development as a job-oriented skills is more important. Secondly, harnessing value, capturing value through growth opportunities. And finally, supporting infrastructure to help CSD and to harness value. What is continued skills development? It is giving the opportunity to those who lack employable skills to join the economic ladder. This leads us to understanding that it is no secret that we live in a time of profound economic inequity, perhaps also taking on form meritocracy. You can see here workers and occupations are increasingly concentrated at the low and high ends of the economic ladder, partly due to meritocracy. I mean, it is a minefield that I do not wish to tread hard, but lightly. Meritocracy means that you have lots of students studying in, and then only the top percentage goes into universities. The rest are all left behind. Even if it's a mark or a half a mark, you cannot get in. So as a nation, it is time to fix this broken approach to talent management for the good of not just the workers, but companies as a whole, as well as societies as a whole. The government must be responsible for offering programs to develop youth, not just programs, but also funding in terms of loans for students who are not able to get university entrance to pursue other avenues of growth. Skills development in Sri Lanka is quite lacking, and it is something that has to be addressed very urgently. Companies should offer apprenticeships as a pathway to gain technical knowledge. Hire in cohorts rather than one or two persons. I quote this from a recent article by Ginny Rometty, the IBM's former chairman, president, and CEO. That's like being the president, prime minister, and the finance minister of a small nation. But much more in terms of impact you can make. And she termed this word new collar. She said it's not blue collar and it's not white collar, but it's new collar, where she hired cohorts of students, some of them very young, 16, 17 years old, in big lots, in 50, 100, 200, right? And they trained them in skills, in different digital skills, in AI, that's suitable for IBM, and that really helped to improve these students. And she says that it's eye-opening, and that's the reason why I call this new collar workers, because most organizations have this policy of, as per her, of hiring degrees. And she said most of it just to filter, for the HR to filter out candidates, because those who have degrees and have not are just filtered out, so that makes life easier for them. But she said that's not the way to go forward. And she said hiring, creating this new collar workforce is something that really should be looked at. So how do we capture value as a nation? Government and private industry must follow a two-pronged approach. First, growth through stimulating local industry. Offer programs to harness potential of overseas workers. I think Dr. Harishchandra pointed out we have a huge outflow of labor from our country, and that's a huge brain drain for us. But we cannot stop it, but what we can do is harness it the betterment of the nation. Offer financial assistance to recent graduates of skill programs in collaboration with the private sector to stimulate local production and capture our non-resident potential by incentivizing them to send funds legally, especially the low-wage earners. Being from the Middle East, I can tell you it's really hard to send funds legally sometimes for these low-wage earners. They work 7 days a week and they hardly have any time to move from their compounds or wherever the sites they are. And for us, we have to empathize with them to ensure that they are able to send funds legally and that they are incentivized to do so. Offer programs for non-residents to invest in the country by offering them long-term financial benefits with priority to those who want to set up entrepreneurial projects. Lastly, consider the Blue Ocean Strategy as a nation-building strategy to harness the potential of its citizens. I'm sure some of you or most of you are aware of the Blue Ocean Strategy, but I give you a video just to refresh your minds. Absolutely. So what is infrastructure development? This is required for CSD as well as for harnessing value. It is to support the growth in the training sector by increasing accessibility and affordability for education and training. It's creating government-funded training facilities which students can get an education and pay back once they start working. I'm sure all of you will understand what I'm trying to say here is to give student loans, but I'm sure we can take the best practices out of the developed countries who have already implemented this and make sure that it's suited to a Sri Lankan flavor. Create e-learning platforms in collaboration with the private sector to teach higher number of students. I'm sure this has already been done by Mr. Dhammika Pereira, but there is a great need to create such e-learning platforms, especially to reach rural areas. Linked to CST, continued skills development, offer loan facilities to purchase equipment for students which is required for skills development. The Ministry of Education has a student loan facility for higher education, and it would be better to take the program forward by offering it for CSD and make it open for anyone who wishes to learn skills to participate, whether they have passed or failed their O-levels or the A-levels, because currently there is a gate in for this program, and that is to be having passed your A-levels. I sincerely believe this nation and its citizens need a second chance. Incentivize companies which hire newly graduated technical students is something that the government can really look into doing. And finally, focus on developing unique solutions and core competencies as organizations and governments. So ladies and gentlemen, stay focused, think different, and I hope I have inspired you to have some better ideas. And finally, I leave you with a small video.
To the crazy ones, the misfits, the rebels, the troublemakers, the round pegs in the square holes, the ones who see things differently. They're not fond of rules, and they have no respect for the status quo. You can quote them, disagree with them, glorify or vilify them. About the only thing you can't do is ignore them, because they change things. They push the human race forward. While some may see them as the crazy ones, we see genius. Because the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do.
Thank you very much to Mr. Hikam Khalid for sharing with us his viewpoint on how we can reboot and reimagine business and strategic thinking. Well, on that note, it's now our pleasure to open up the panel for discussion. Before I hand it over to the moderator, I'd once again like to remind everybody in the audience about the QR code that is on your tables. If you'd like to address your questions to the panelists, feel free to scan the QR code and send your question to that WhatsApp number, and our moderator will get it on her tab, and she will then use that to direct the conversation forward. So on that, it's now my pleasure to hand over control to our session chair and moderator for this discussion. Let's put our hands together for Ms. Gayani Punchiheva.
While listening to Professor Lakshman Vatavala's welcome address only, I realized what I am supposed to do here today amidst these four gentlemen. He mentioned the need for women in active management roles to steer and guide the conversation. So let me take this time to pick the brains of these distinguished gentlemen to understand how we can reboot, reimagine the government and public sector. So we listened to Dr. Harish Chandra and Mr. Ikram Khalid talking of it. So let's move on to Asanga and Nalin. What are your thoughts on the topic of reboot and reimagine the government and public sector, business and strategy from your personal experiences?
Right. So thank you very much for that question, and your, the audience, I think, would have got a great insight into some of the things the country is going through, especially currently, and the best part of it, which I picked up from the presentation, was that we have hope. The country seems to be recovering, and from a hopeless situation, we seem to be moving into a situation where there is hope and there is belief that we can recover. But two things are very important, and I think it was pointed out very well by Doctor's presentation, is that the reforms that need to be implemented, we need the public support as well as the political will. The second point, which is very important mostly to the private sector, is that more and more into the future, we will have to compete in a global environment, be it free trade agreements, be it low tariff situations, and so on. So a lot of the time we think when the IMF tranche comes in, the problem is going to be solved. I think it is far from that. For 2 years, we will not be paying our debt, but after that, the debt has to be paid, and we'll get back hopefully to a situation where we will have to compete. So in these 2 years, reforms and our preparation to compete in a global marketplace is key. And that is what we need to first, Gayani, prepare for. The will to go through that, the political will, as well as the support from all of us is required as a country for us to face these challenges. And as Hakim pointed out, we have to have the empathy, we have to have the people to do that. Now, having worked in private sector for a long time and now working in public sector, I can guarantee you of one thing. We have the brains to do it. We certainly have the brains to do it, but the know-how we need to develop. For example, how we can create value, how we can make our organizations more customer-centric, how we can compete in the global marketplace, how we enroll people towards what we want to do as a country. All those things need to be taught, and our people need to believe that. There's no point complaining and blaming for what happened in the past. Of course, there's no point complaining and blaming the politicians. It's good to have that discussion over a drink or something, but every day when we continue to do that, it's not going to take us anywhere as a country. There is a role for each one of us, and if we play that role, I think we have the brains, we have the people to do it. What is required is the will.
Right. I think first thing is we need to realize SOEs, state-owned enterprises, are providing essential infrastructure and public services to the highest impacted areas of the economy. And if you see the names of SOEs, CPC, CEB, National Water Supply and Drainage Board, State Pharmaceutical, then State Engineering, People's Bank, Bank of Ceylon, all these are large companies, large corporations. If you take my bank is in the top 30 as per the Business Today magazine. Our bank's turnover, annual turnover is 25 billion. But if you take CPC's annual turnover is 600 billion. So you can see these institutions are not doing a yeoman service, because these are huge infrastructure and public service institutions. Mind you, on top of that, these institutions also create employment. 10% of the public service employment is created by the 55 SOEs we are discussing. Then poverty elevation, they give subsidies. Then fiscal stability. Fiscal stability is from the tax earned, the government tax earned, the expenses. Then development of different sectors, like say plantation sector, say Bogala graphites, so something like that. Then also environment protection. So we need to acknowledge, first thing is even though there is a huge public outcry for the government SOEs, we need to acknowledge that they are doing a huge service to the nation. And if you take Gayani, out of these SOEs, the highest profit-making institutions are, I'm also lucky to be in that category, are the financial institutions. Bank of Ceylon, People's Bank, and NSB are making the highest profits out of the SOEs of this country. What does that show? There has to be something meaningful happening in this financial sector compared to others. So I also did a study, being a person who always likes to learn. Then I realized that there is a strong regulatory body covering these financial institutions. That is the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. Central Bank of Sri Lanka, mind you, is very proactive. Whenever we go through issues, we get a circular. Say there is an issue with regard to liquidity, they study it, and they immediately send circulars to overcome those situations. So on top of that, not only financial. Now, if Bank of Ceylon, People's Bank, and NSB is listed in the capital markets, of course, they will have to submit their financial reports, everything, for the public to see. But that is also not happening. However, because there is a regulatory body who is checking these financials on a quarterly basis, and also this regulatory body is doing spot audits. This regulatory body is looking at our corporate governance practices. This regulatory body is looking at our compliance on a regular basis. So that is why the financial sector of the SOEs is performing so well. So that is a good lesson for us to learn. And I think these are lessons that we should always check and do with regard to the other sectors of this industry as well. So that is my opening remarks for this forum. I think it's food for thought for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Nalin. Continuing on to your keynote, Dr. Harish Chandra, we all saw a snapshot of our economic situation. And we would like to hear from you. And also, with the interest of the time, I'm actually combining some of the questions that I am receiving from the audience as well. So the audience, as well as I, would like to hear from you. What are the regulatory practices that you all are taking for this revival process? So you spoke of the twin deficits. So what actions, now we hear from your keynote, a snapshot. So from moving on that, and also there's a question that has stemmed from the audience, which asks how the central bank going to get the support of the improved export industries. Also asking, what if IMF program fails? I'm not very sure whether you are in a liberty to speak of, but then again, I think it's a question that we all have in our minds.
Thank you for that question. So let me try and answer the way that I can. First, to touch into the regulatory part of that. So yes, as Aline said, we have for the banking sector, we have set regulations which are coming from the Banking Act and the Monetary Law Act. Now, as I just sort of highlighted in this presentation, so who's looking after the performance of the fiscal sector? So what regulation governs the fiscal sector performance? Who's behind that? So if something goes wrong, and what regulatory actions that we can take? So we have the public finance is the prerogative of the Parliament of Sri Lanka. And we have some legislation which governs the performance of the fiscal sector. And one key piece of legislation is the Fiscal Management Responsibility Act, which was enacted in 2003. And now we are here 20 years later. We couldn't achieve the intended outcomes of the fiscal. Thank you. So we couldn't achieve the targets. So we had a budget deficit target in the FMRA. We had a debt target in the FMRA. But what we did was we've changed these targets in the process, and we amended the FMRA 3 times so far. So we want some binding commitment from the fiscal side to achieve these targets. Otherwise, we will not be able to prevent a similar crisis from happening going forward. So that's why I think, so coming back to the last question, if IMF, so IMF program is something, the reforms that we have identified under the IMF program is the government-owned reforms that the government has been sort of planning for years, but never got implemented. These are very hard reforms, as you are already seen the resistance from the public for some of these reforms. And these are very unpopular reforms, but which are needed to put the house in order. So the IMF program is a 4-year program, so that there are 5 key major areas have been identified to make these reforms happen, and we benefit from them. So these areas mainly cover the fiscal sector. So you want to make sure that our revenue increases to about 15% of GDP level from the current 8% of GDP. And you go to contain the accumulation of government debt. And for that, we need to control the borrowing. And that will happen through an improvement in the primary balance. And then in the process, and we are sort of inflicting a lot of pain on the society, and the most vulnerable segment of society needs support. And I think in the IMF program itself, that need is recognized, and there are some allocations which are specified in the budgetary process to support this vulnerable segment of society. And that's one aspect of that. And then, so the regulatory requirement is to strengthen the Fiscal Management Responsibility Act as one hand. And the other aspect is another piece of legislation which is in discussion now. It is in Parliament actually already, the central bank independence, the central bank bill. Because what we have been doing in the past is that when the budget deficit increases, part of the deficit was financed from central bank money, which is monetary financing, which leads to inflation. So now the new bill prevents monetary financing going forward. So once this is enacted, so there's no central bank financing will be available for the government. So the fiscal operations will have to be carefully balanced so that without depending on the central bank funds, which is inflation. That's why, world over, central banks are independent. Central banks are not supposed to finance government budgets. So this new bill will have some legislative arrangements to prevent that from happening. So these are 2 key major pieces of legislation that we are looking at. This is to strengthen the fiscal rules and to strengthen the central bank independence. And then we have to, of course, ensure the banking sector sustainability or system stability through regular supervision and some macro-prudential surveillance mechanism. That's also is part of the new Central Bank Act, which is recognized separately. And then now these are like near-term priorities. So in the near term, you got to get the fiscal house in order, you got to reduce the budget deficit, you got to manage the debt accumulation, and then with the central bank independence, you can have more stability in the price level as well without inflationary pressures. So when you get the inflation down under control and the interest rates and exchange rates can support the businesses, because if you don't have price stability and inflation being, now it is 50% level, which is one of the highest in the world. But as we are looking into the 12 months horizon into the future, inflation can come down, and then the sustaining that price stability is a major requirement. And then moving into near to medium term, we got to address these other issues which are structural in nature, to promote competitiveness, to promote productivity, and all of that will have to happen. And the private sector and the professionals will have a great role to play in sort of enhancing the growth potential. So the last point is that the IMF fails, that these legislations will actually have binding commitments so that the policymakers will stick to it. And the government has shown its firm commitment to the IMF program, and hopefully those binding commitments will prevail. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Harishchandra. Hikram, you actually, being a migrant professional, you spoke of the importance of harnessing the true potential of the human resource. So what's your take on taking the best out of Sri Lankan human resources? Do you think that we should retain the workforce in Sri Lanka, or you think that we should position ourselves to send the professional labor to outside world and get the remittances?
I think that's something that you and I cannot really force on a person. That's the person's circumstances. But as Dr. Harishchandra was saying, I would like to take up his last point, where the new central bank bill coming up, the government really needs new sources of income, and one way to do that would be to expand the tax base. I know taxation right now is a pretty dirty word here, but the government has been always picking on a very small base of citizens to fill their coffers, and I think widening it would be really beneficial for the government. I think this is where, as I said, CSD, the continuous skill development, comes in. As a government, if you don't improve the lot of your people, there's no way you're going to have enough revenue going to come from taxes. And all your people that are going abroad are mostly low-skilled workers. But I tell you something, they're pretty smart, low-skilled people. I have my neighbor, Saudi gentleman, he employs a maid, and she's from a pretty rural area, and she's been there in Saudi Arabia for quite some time, I think for the last 10, 12 years. And I tell you, she speaks the most beautiful Arabic. And Arabic is not a simple language, it's a pretty complex language. And I've been there 25 years, and I hardly can string a few words together. So, we as a people, we think that only people who have finished their A-levels or done a degree are suitable to the working class, but rather I would say we are having huge resources in terms of human capital, which we have not tapped into, which we have left fallen behind. And these are the people that we should really grow to help our nation grow. I tell you one more story. Yesterday night, children only remember their homework when it's 8, 9 o'clock in the night, right? So I was trying to run around with my daughter. She has an exam today, so he wants her some papers. So I was running around trying to find a bookshop, and I got this guy near my mom's place, and he was a young fellow. So I said, why you open late tonight? He's like, sir, make a business taker. This is my business, right? So I said, what have you been doing? He said, I'm a university graduate. I did visual art, so I'm doing this printing shop, and I have run a bookstore. And he said, so that's why I'm open, basically. So I said, what's your plan for the future? He's like, Mama, bank going loan ගන්න හදනවා 130ක් වුණත් මට loan එකක් දෙන්නේ නැහැ. I mean, I hope Professor Vohra understood what I've said. That so the potential for the people to improve, they want to improve, and as a government, I'm sure once the crisis is over, there has to be certain programs that has to be put in place that really help bring up the middle class, the lower middle class, all this generational, all this generation which has been lost due to COVID. Students from rural areas really are struggling to learn, and as a government, I think we should really look at these points of view.
Asanga. So as an educator, an experienced professional in both the private and government sector, what is your take on the need of the RAs?
Sigani, I think there's a lot of discussion about reforming and restructuring the SOEs and the government sector, and without doubt that has to be done. But there are lots of private sector professionals sitting here, and I was also in the private sector for a long time. I think there's a huge role for the private sector to take our country forward. The best example is to look at Korean Republic. At one time, when you look at Korea and Korean brands, we really looked down on them. But look at some of the brands that they have created in the market, the Kias, the Hyundais, the Samsungs, and the LGs, and so on. A country which in one generation has moved from a third world country to a first world country by having such powerful brands and focusing on the global marketplace. Now, of course, our apparel industry has done wonders for the country. So while these reforms and restructuring and all that happens in SOEs and the government sector, I think we from the private sector, there is a big role for us to play in terms of looking at opportunities for the country to get foreign currency in. For that, we need to have a global mindset, and we must think from the beginning and from our businesses, from our business plans and growth plans and all that about exploiting and going out there and getting a chunk of the world market. It's not easy, but it can be done. Lots of countries have done it, a lot of brands have done it, some of our brands have done it, and we are very proud about it. So I think while one side gets reformed, there is a role for each one of us, especially in the private sector, to see how we could harness and exploit opportunities out there in the global market. If we do that right, in the next 4 years, as Doctor said, 5 years, if we can create a few global brands, my God, we'll be adding a lot of value or creating value to our country.
We need to benchmark government and state sector to understand where they should be aiming for. So, Nalin, coming from your experience of a private sector, what are the best management practices of the private sector that we should think government should adopt and learn from to start with their reboot strategy, and when they want to reimagine where they want to go for?
Right. Now, the golden rule in business is if you don't make profits, you don't sustain. I think each and everybody who is into a business or a SOE should know this. Now, how do we make profits? It's a story that's being discussed. Cost-reflective pricing. This is being discussed, and luckily, with the economic crash we had, now the SOEs are coming up with cost-reflective pricing mechanisms. Now take, for instance, I will take an example. CEB has a huge head office in Slave Island. Oh, yeah. Now is the rent. If you look at a private organization, we would have taken a huge rent as our expenses for this building. Do we do that? No. Those are the subsidies the SOEs are getting. So hopefully, no one from CEB is here and increase the prices again of the electricity bills, but this is a fact. So the pricing has to reflect the cost. There is no doubt about that. But I think with the latest reforms, people have given a leeway. The masses have given a leeway for the government to do these reforms because they don't want to be in queues and in the dark anymore. So that's good. And on top of that, strategic direction we are discussing. Strategic direction has 4 stages. One is environmental scanning, that is called SWOT, right? Number 2 is strategy implementation. Strategy formulation, implementation, and number 4 is review. Now, with regard to environmental scanning, the SWOT, if you look at it, government SOEs, they have a lot of advantages, right? If you look at their opportunities and threats, we'll take, for instance, we'll take an organization like State Pharmaceutical, right? I don't see any competition to them, right? There are a lot of opportunities. If they really strategize, State Pharmaceutical will have a lot of opportunities. The issue is their weaknesses, internal weaknesses, inherent weaknesses, right? So if you do a SWOT of a government SOE, they are far ahead of a private company because they are monopolies. Number 3, financial transparency. I think this is where the SOEs, state-owned enterprises, which is our subject here, should be listed in capital markets. I don't know how we are going to do it. There has to be a way in listing SOEs in capital markets, in share markets. Then naturally, the corporate governance, the accountability, financial transparency will come into effect. Then accountability of the state-owned enterprises officers. Now, for instance, my KPIs have been finalized already of my bank, and my KPIs have already been given, set, and my KPIs for the last year have been analyzed, and I have been analyzed properly, and I have given my KPIs, I have cascaded it down to all my staff, and all my staff, mind you, have 80% financial KPIs, whereas only 20% is subjective. So these sort of KPIs needs to go to SOEs as well if they are to make profits. Then also strengthen corporate governance. I think this is where the regulatory body comes in, like central bank. So this is where I think all SOEs, irrespective of the segment they are in, there has to be a body, a strong body that regulates these companies or these corporations. On top of that, I also want to emphasize on a few other things. SOEs, state-owned enterprises, the decisions are basically politicized. How do we overcome that? You overcome, it's an issue, but you overcome that by arranging the composition of the board of that SOE, right? There can be 2 politicized people in that board, but you can have 3 businessmen in that board. So these are the ways we have to look at. Of course, we cannot always say we cannot do this, but we must find out ways of doing things. We must find out the loopholes to resurrect these SOEs. And on top of that, I think government servants should realize that 85% of the taxes paid by mainly the private sector is going to government sector employee monthly payments, monthly salaries, right? So even though we say the employment is increasing in the government sector, there is another side to it. So these messages need to go to SOEs, and that knowledge needs to go to those SOEs. And also, these monopolies. I was thinking, right, how do we overcome a monopoly? Take the railways department. This is a suggestion. I was thinking of this. Railways department, if you go to say, we are going to restructure the railways department, no one will agree from the railways department. But say, we take the Kandy to Colombo railway line only. And we say, we are going to restructure this and those stations, those railway tracks, those employees, the engines, the locomotives. We do a segment only and see how that particular SBU work. Why can't we do that? We can do that. So there has to be some rational thinking coming in, and then you have a separate SBU for the Kandy Colombo railway track only. Then the others will see, then the Mahatara, Putlam, Sitavaka, railway people will see how, okay, this track is doing well and they are making profits, they are paying bonuses to them, right? So I think these sort of things should come up. You can't suddenly go and do changes to the entire SOE, but you take it stage by stage. And that is what we are doing. That is what the private sector is doing. You don't go and do changes as a whole. You take item by item and change it. And also, my point in the hidden expenses of the government, like the buildings, right? Those are actually real expenses in massive buildings, massive expenditure on electricity. I don't know. If you take a private organization, we will see that when we are going out, we will switch off our computer, we switch off our lights. So these things needs to come in. I think for this super forums like this, Gayani, will add value to all this, and I think that should be the way forward.
Thank you, Nalin, for your valuable insights. We realize that not only macro, but micro level, lot of lessons that the good management practices the government sector can adopt from the best practices of private sector. Coming to you, Dr. Harish Chandra, even at the address of Professor Vohra, she mentioned that brave are the people who understand they have failed, but try to come out of it. So are we heading at the right direction now, central bank? And also the audience has a question. One bank from US already collapsed. Is the Sri Lankan banking sector safe?
Right. That's a very difficult question. I will answer that broadly because are we heading in the right direction? I think we are due to the following, because now the topic for today is the rebooting the public sector. Now we are actually rebooting the overall economy, because we hit the rock bottom in terms of our growth, hitting -8, and we hit the inflation very high at 70% in September. And now both directions are now trending in the positive way. Now our challenge is to, and we lost confidence, and the public lost confidence, and businesses lost confidence, and that's why people are leaving the country. But how can we bring back confidence, and how our businesses can perform without much of uncertainty going forward? So the answers will depend on how the sort of major macroeconomic variables will fall in place going forward. So if our interest rates can come down from 25-30% level to manageable levels, if we can expect some more stability in the exchange rate going forward, and there was a question about the export sector as well in the previous round, and though the stability in the exchange rate is a key determinant of any support for importers as well as exporters. So on that front, I'm hopeful that things are sort of getting better As we see, the market is reflective of the fact that some improvements are happening in the market, and as you will also have noticed that, our the call money markets and the exchange rate markets are operative now. There were a lot of some inaction in the past. So on that front, and more reforms in terms of SOEs about this cost-reflective pricing, then that have taken a major pressure from the government, of the government budget, because government was funding those loss-making SOEs for quite some time. But going forward, at least this cost-reflective pricing will help make profits for these SOEs, and the discipline that it will be brought into the fiscal management and monetary management with new legislation, so that I think we are heading in the right direction. And the challenge for us is to how we can sustain this momentum going forward, and that requires the resolve of the policymakers and the support from the public at large.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Harishchandra. Even Honorable Karu Jayasuriya mentioned about the need for the government sector to be more streamlined, and also one of the panelists also mentioned that we need to have a more lean government structure to refrain from having too much of weight of the expenses. So Hikram, coming on to you, how do you think that we should, if we go ahead with the IMF program and go ahead with this making the lean government structure, how can we reskill and upskill the existing government sector employees to be absorbed to the private sector and be more productive in the private sector?
It's mainly about job creation and skills development. I think that's the key here. Developing when you make when you make the SOEs, as Ravi said, to make it leaner, you have to then give jobs to these people. You can't have unemployment going up as well. So skills development is what is most important, and a lot of them also can have potential to then have their own businesses, launch entrepreneurial jobs. So this is somewhere that we can really look and see how we can take these organizations forward.
Thank you. Over to you, Asanga. Continue from what you spoke earlier. How do you think this strategic application of value creation can help us to reboot the government and the state sector?
I think this principle of value is very, very important today, as never been before, because it's all about, I think everybody is saying this, it's all about creating value outside to the customers, be it SOE, be it a private sector organization. Private sector does it very well. You create value to the people, so people are not complaining about paying for that value, be it electricity, be it petroleum, be it water. So you create value so much that therefore people are saying, okay, we will pay for that, like we pay for good brands when we buy. Now, when you capture that value inside the organization, that is where the problem is. This cost-based pricing, I think it's important, but cost also has to be competitive costs. Now, the customer out there or the consumer out there is not willing to pay, as you said, Anil, for the head office that is in Fort, or all the other expenses of reimbursing the loans, the SOEs paying the taxes on behalf of the employees. Those costs are not cost competitive. So create value outside to the people, so people are willing to pay for that, then capture that value inside the organization. In a way, finally you create value to the shareholder. So in the case of the SOEs, the shareholder is the government. There's no way that you borrow from the shareholder and then waste that money. You have to create value inside the organization. Therefore, the shareholder is very well looked after. Now, what is happening today is that we are borrowing at a rate and the shareholder is funding at a rate and it is never ending. Now, this doesn't happen in private sector. So the same rules have to apply, where you create value outside, you capture value inside, and then you manage your costs so well that finally there's no burden on the shareholder. That is the simple principle of business. And you look at what private sector does in our country and look at what SOEs do in other countries. There are lots of examples of SOEs doing year on year in creating value both outside, capturing value inside and creating value to the shareholders, the employees, the other stakeholders, everybody. And then you run a business in a competitive manner which is sustainable for the country.
Yeah, thank you, Asanka. We see how quick thinking and adaptive the private sector in this to the dynamic changes of the VUCA world. So Nalin, what do you think that organizations like CPM and private sector, how we can go extra mile to support the government sector to reboot and reimagine their strategy?
Right, Gaini. I think number one is, as I mentioned initially, the private sector should acknowledge the yeoman service done by the SOEs. We know it's a difficult task. Number two, I think we need to also get in competition to the SOEs, maybe on a gradual way. With regard to like what we did to petroleum, right? Like what we did to telecom. Of course, telecom is now is not taken as a SOE, I suppose. Then with regard to maybe state engineering, right? So a part can be, because private organizations cannot spend so much. These are large amounts we are looking at. So a part of that can be given to the private sector and then you lead to competition. So that is one way of doing it. And also, I want to mention this as well. Now, the Sri Lankan economy is going through a restructure, right? Dr. Harishchandra is also here, right? So similarly, now the banks have lent, our banks have lent 1 trillion to the SOEs. So if the SOEs are not performing well, the banks can do a similar thing what the IMF is doing. They can impose conditions. If that SOE is not performing well, they can say, because the banks are funding these SOEs. They can say, look here, your cost has to come down this year by this amount. Your pricing is not correct. Because we in banks, we have educated, dedicated project finance guys who knows with regard to these specific areas, even though they may not be so conversant as them. But the banks can definitely look into these areas and, change some of those SOEs in line with, like in the IMFA is doing to the country right now.
Yeah, thank you so much for such insightful ideas. Actually, we all understand that we are all facing uphill journey here, the government sector, public sector, and all individuals of Sri Lanka. So with the interest of the time, I would like to request all of you all to give a 1-minute quick closing remarks of the individual responsibilities that we all have to support the government sector to reboot and reimagine the strategy. Dr. Harishchandra first.
Thank you, Gaini. Quickly, I think we need, my request is to the public at large, we need to be patient and perseverance, because we had two major economic issues, which is high debt and low reserves. So these two issues are being addressed now. High debt will be addressed by forthcoming debt restructuring strategy. And the lack of reserves is being addressed by some assistance from the IMF, and with that, the confidence that will be built into the economy will invite and more funding assistance from World Bank, ADB, and also the private sector will see Sri Lanka as a destination that can recover fast, and we can come back from this crisis situation. And we have lots of potential in the economy, and foreign investors are already showing more interest, show a lot of interest to come to the port city and energy sector, for instance. And so during this period, we need to be little, yes, we are going through a very painful patch and very painful process, but we naturally tend to lose our patience. But let's be patient a bit for the next 6 to 12 months and see how we can and we can come back very strongly. Thank you.
Patience is the key word for him, from him.
I refer you to my presentation where I said moonshot thinking is what we need to do. The government has to increase with this new central bank legally. We have to really look at how the government really needs to look at how they can develop their citizens, and to make sure that we grow very well. I mean, we are all very fond of talking about Sri Lanka and Singapore, but I was telling somebody that we should rather compare ourselves to Taiwan. I mean, Taiwan was an agrarian nation not about 4 or 5 decades ago, and see where they are now. And there are a lot of people who moved out from Taiwan coming back into Taiwan because it's such a developed country and investing in that country. And Sri Lanka should follow something similar. There should be some kind of a moonshot strategy. I'm sure we saw the CPC, the energy minister talking about reducing CPC to certain levels, and then you had the tourism minister looking at a moonshot of how many tourism arrivals that he wanted. So similarly, as a government, we need to look at the economy as a whole and how we can really grow it.
Yeah, so human development, human capital development is what the ultimate sake from him. Asanka?
Gaini, I think there are 2 words. One is resilience to go through this period. And once we come out of it, we need clear-cut strategies, not only in SOEs, but in private sector as well, to compete, as I started at the beginning, compete in a global marketplace. Now, resilience, of course, is required at a very high level now, but that's not enough. After 2 years, when we start paying our debt and so on, and when the country recovers, we need strategies, both at the government sector as well as in the private sector, to compete in a global marketplace, which is going to be highly competitive, highly uncertain, and we need to somehow win in the medium to long term.
So it's starting patience, human capital development, resilience and strategy. Nalin?
I think change of business models. Take our farmers. There was a video that went viral. From the day they start cultivation, they are asking for water free of charge. Then they ask for fertilizer. Then they ask for pesticides at low cost. And then when the harvest is ready, they are saying harvest is no more. Harvest is less. Again crying. Then they want a certified price because nobody is buying it. Now, mind you, this is the largest commodity that is being used by consumers. And then the middleman says, the rice miller says, no, we are making a loss out of that. Then the government buys it again. They give everything and the government again buys it. Then the government sells it to Satosa. Satosa says, we are making a loss out of this. Right? And we, the consumers, we also go and say, this rice, why are we buying at these prices? So we are making a loss out of that also. So who is making a profit out of this whole scenario? No one is making a profit. That is what it appears. But is there a hidden profit that's going on? We don't know it. But these sort of business models, now being the largest commodity in the country, and if everybody involved in that is saying this is a loss-making commodity, we have a big issue. Right? So the business models need to change. I think I need to elaborate on one aspect because this is a CPM. Coaching is one thing we need to do to our people. Coaching is achieving a goal within a short period of time. We don't have time, mind you. Sri Lanka doesn't have time. We need to achieve some set goals within a short period of time, and we need to do that. So thank you.
Thank you, Nalin. I think we can summarize our whole conversation here. Patience, human capital development, resilience and strategy, change of models, and coaching. Thank you.
Let's put our hands together, ladies and gentlemen, for our wonderful panelists and our moderator as well. Thank you for adding great value to our gathering by sharing your thoughts on rebooting and reimagining government and public sector as well as business and strategy. Well, before we tell our panelists to leave the floor, we'd like to, of course, provide them with tokens of appreciation. So I'd now like to invite on stage the following dignitaries to join us. We'd like to invite Professor Lakshman R. Vatawala, Dr. Samantha Ratnaika, Mrs. Primrose Mascarenas, all the Governing Council members who are in the audience. And we'd like to invite Mr. Dilshan R. Sukularatna, Director of CPM Sri Lanka, to please join us on stage as we now present tokens of appreciation to our panelists and our moderator. As our dignitaries join us, let me once again remind you, ladies and gentlemen, of who our speakers were on stage. Our session chairperson and moderator is Gayani Punchiheva, Head of Marketing, Digital and Integrated Media of Vijaya Newspapers Limited. We have a token of appreciation coming to Miss Gayani Punchiheva. Let's put our hands together as we appreciate her contribution. And once again, as you see, we have ensure that we give them a slice of Sri Lankan heritage. We're giving them some photographs taken at least 140 years ago. So there we go. We now would like to say thank you to Dr. P.G.K. Harish Chandra. He's Director of Economic Research Department at Central Bank of Sri Lanka. Put your hands together for Dr. Harish Chandra. Next up, we would like to say thank you to the Vice President at GLT Freight, Saudi Arabia. We have Mr. Hikam Khalid, one of our speakers. Put your hands together for Mr. Hikam Khalid. Next up, we'd like to say thank you to the chairperson at Sri Lanka Standards Institution. We have Mr. Asanga Ranasinghe here. He's also senior faculty at PIM. So thank you for joining us. Let's put our hands together for Mr. Asanga Ranasinghe. And finally, we'd like to say thank you to the Chief Executive Officer Designate at Pan Asia Banking Corporation. We have Mr. Nalin Edrasinghe. Put your hands together for Mr. Edrasinghe. On that note, I'd like to invite all our dignitaries to please remain on stage along with our panelists because we have a quick opportunity for a group photograph. Our four panelists, our moderator, as well as our dignitaries on behalf of CPM Sri Lanka. This is our first panel discussion for the day, ladies and gentlemen, on rebooting and reimagining government and public sector, as well as business and strategy. So we take this opportunity now to capture this memory. We have a photographer ready. And on that note, ladies and gentlemen, can we once again hear a huge round of applause as we say thank you very much to our panelists for adding great value and sharing their expertise with us. Thank you once again. With that, ladies and gentlemen, we are now about to break for lunch.